So I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's event, which is focused on the current state of progressive media. As many of you know, the Graduate Center is not only a school of arts and sciences, but we're also a platform for conversation, performance, and debate. And to that end, we are presenting over the course of this year an initiative called Cultural Capital, the Promise and Price of New York's Creative Economy. And what we're doing is, over the course of the entire year, mounting an institution-wide series of lectures, panel discussions like tonight's event, performances and screenings, all focused on different aspects of the city's creative economy and its future. So I'd encourage you to look at the brochure that we put together, which is on the table out in front, and to visit the Cultural Capital website, which you'll be able to find the URL in that brochure. So we hope that many of you will be able to attend a lot of these events. So tonight, as part of our focus on the creative economy, we've brought together a stellar group of writers and editors who are going to examine the current state of progressive media. We have Katha Pollitt, Nermeen Shaikh, Reid, and of course Peter Beinart. So I just want to introduce them quickly and get out of the way so they can start the discussion. So critic, writer, and poet Katha Pollitt has been contributing to The Nation since 1980. Many of her contributions to the magazine are compiled in the books Reasonable Creatures, Subject to Debate, and Virginity or Death. She has also published 2 collections of personal essays, Learning to Drive and Other Life Stories, and The Mind-Body Problem. Her 1992 essay on the culture wars, Why We Read, Canon to the Right of Me, won the National Magazine Award for Essays and Criticism, and that same year she was awarded a Whiting Foundation Writing Award. Her essays, book reviews, and poems have appeared in numerous publications. Reid is managing editor of thegrio.com and also an on-air contributor on MSNBC. She's also a political columnist for the Miami Herald and editor of the political blog, The Reid Report. Having worked in television and radio news since 1998, she has appeared as a political commentator on CNBC and Britain's Sky News. Ms. Reid is a graduate of Harvard University, where she majored in visual arts with a concentration in documentary film, and where she was a 2003 Knight Center for Specialized Journalism Fellow. Nermeen Shaikh is a broadcast news producer and the weekly co-host of Democracy Now! A former managing editor at the Asia Society, she has also worked at nonprofit organizations in London, Islamabad, and Tehran. The author of The Present as History, Critical Perspectives on Global Power, she studied politics at Cambridge University. And finally, our moderator for tonight is Peter Beinart. Peter is senior political writer at the Daily Beast and the author of 4 books, including The Icarus Syndrome, and most recently, The Crisis of Zionism. He's an associate professor here at the CUNY Graduate Center and at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Peter has also been instrumental in organizing a host of high-profile and popular events here at the Graduate Center, for which we are extremely grateful, and of which tonight is one. So please join me in welcoming our participants.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to start out with a kind of broad question that I'm going to ask all 3 of you, and I think that it'll hopefully serve as the fodder for follow-up questions before we go to the audience. And I'll start with you, Katha. There's no mic to pass. They're just all on our lapels or here. So. If it's difficult for you to hear, maybe there may be a seat closer up to the front.
There's a seat right here.
There's one right up in the front. Okay. So the question I want to ask to all of you, but I'll start with Katha, is when you think about this moment for progressive media in the context of your career as a writer, maybe even going back further in historical context, by comparison, are we living in the best of times for progressive media or the worst of times, or where are we in between?
I think if you want to express yourself, we're living in the best of times. If you want to get paid for your work, we're living in the worst of times. I mean, anybody can start a blog, right? And there's wonderful writing on the internet. I just am amazed by how much good writing there is. It's very imaginative, very well written, very knowledgeable. I learned so much from the blogosphere. But the blogosphere is free. So how are all those people living? A lot of people, surprising number of really interesting and valuable and well-known commentators have whole other jobs, promoting vodka, or they're academics or whatever. I think that it's really, really hard to make a living doing this. And the blogosphere, the internet, has made it hard for everybody, even people who are working in the more old-fashioned media, because there's so much free stuff out there, it puts a ceiling on how much anybody has to be paid. I'm sorry to be so depressing about it, but I think the economics of it are terrible, terrible.
I mean, would you agree that this is an environment where we have this paradox where you can write all you want, but basically only people who are independently wealthy or have some other source of income can essentially will be able to afford to do it?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I think, Katha, you're right in your diagnosis, but I think that there's also the problem of hierarchies of media. In other words, even though everybody can contribute, and that has a very good side. In other words, we get access now to videos, to blogs, to writing, to audio that we would never otherwise have access to because of citizen journalists, what are called citizen journalists. Just anybody, any one of you could decide to upload something to the internet. And if some journalist is intrepid enough, they can search Google and find it. But the problem is that the vast majority of information that comes up, even in a standard Google search, is still by and large information that is generated by what tend to be the most powerful media outlets. So that's one part of it. The other part, of course, I mean, as far as the financial viability of independent, or as you call it, progressive media is concerned, obviously the state is rather tenuous, and my career is rather more modest than my other panelists. I've only been working at Democracy Now! for 3 years, but I can certainly, rather than compare it temporally, compare it geographically. It is very, very striking, let's just say, the extent of uniformity of positions that tend to be expressed in the US mainstream media. And the conversation tends to be so much, we're constantly asked the question, well, why is the media in the US so partisan? In other words, it's a question of a split between the Republican and Democrat Party, and there's some channels or outlets that support one and not the other, or give too much voice to one and not the other. But perhaps another question that could be raised is, to what extent is the media in general compliant with what are broadly construed as the interests of the American state, irrespective of who occupies its highest offices?
Joy, so do you agree that that this is a bad time to try to make a living as a journalist, and what about this idea that even those people who are making a living as a journalist are essentially mostly kind of complicit with the basic assumptions of American power?
Well, I've kind of been on a few sides of it because I was a blogger and still do have a blog, so I was in that world and have worked for a big mainstream media company that also has web properties. And one of the things I think people misconstrue about the whole blog world is that it is a completely sort of independent voice, because whether it's one of the big blogs or whether it's an individual blog, a lot of them are very much reliant on mainstream media. For instance, it's commentary on something that was in the Washington Post, or it's a take on something that was in the New York Times. A lot of the original reporting of news is still housed in the big media companies because they're the only ones with the resources. And so a lot of what you're seeing online is commentary, and that's been democratized. Everyone's commentary is sort of made equal by the blog space, but it is still the super bloggers, the big people that have the big voices, and it does tend to drown out smaller people. I think when it comes to how compliant people are with power, it's because we kind of are in the age of like the celebrity journalist, and now journalists are not the hard scrabble guy that's out there, shaking down City Hall and for information and making enemies. It's more about making friends and having allies and having access. And you have a small cadre of very well-paid journalists who have incredible access and who are reluctant to risk it. So I think you have a lot less risk-taking in journalism. You have a lot fewer people who can make a living. And then as somebody who has to hire writers, there's a lot less professionalism as well. It's hard, believe it or not, with all the voices out there to actually find really strong writers with a great point of view and with reporting skills, because people aren't going through a newspaper and learning how to be a beat journalist in a metro section anymore. They're not coming to you with those skills. They're coming to you essentially with the ability to write their opinion, coming from either a blog space where they're essentially commenting on other people's work. But the idea of being an original journalist who's out there muckraking, this is not a skill people are coming to you with anymore. So when I'm trying to hire writers, first just trying to find really strong writers is hard enough, and then finding people who have reporting chops is difficult. And I think on the progressive part of your question, for that, I'm knocking over my coffee, it's a weird time to be a progressive journalist because you have a Democrat in the White House. You have somebody who's, a lot of what made him attractive was being against the war. So he's sort of with progressives on that, but more centrist on other things. So it's interesting, the commentary on power when the power is sort of us. And I think for African-American journalists, it's sort of compounded by the fact that you have this historic first black president. And so then how do you comment on that, and what is your relationship to that when your readers adore the guy, right? So it's like you have to balance.
I want to sharpen it a little bit. If I'm interpreting you correctly, there was a suggestion that even the people who are considered to be on the left side of the partisan divide actually are constricted within a position where they're still, as you, in your words, arguing for the interests of the American state. You're very connected to MSNBC. I'm going on your show tomorrow on MSNBC.
Not borrowing the show, not my show.
Right, the show that you're guest hosting. Is that a fair critique of MSNBC, that although they seem to be in this fierce argument representing the left in American politics, in fact, the assumptions that they share with Fox and with the interests of the American state, however one defines that, are actually more significant than them being progressive?
Well, I mean, I think that, first of all, MSNBC is not as uniform as people make it out to be. The hosts are in varying degrees, some more progressive than others. In a lot of cases, particularly earlier in the day, there are a lot of proper journalists on MSNBC, like Chris Jansing, et cetera, who really are doing the day-to-day news. They aren't there doing commentary. But when you get to the after 5 p.m. commentary, even that varies. There are people who are much more critical at times of the administration than others. It kind of varies. And it's an awkward position to be in if you are an opinion journalist, and I am an opinion journalist, and I'm very open about the fact that I am, because you do, in a sense, develop alliances with powerful people because that's how you do your job. And at the same time, you are at least sympathetic in some ways to the struggles that people have versus their enemies. For instance, when you're commenting on the Obama administration, the context of that is a Republican Party that is extremely rejectionist. So how far do you go in pushing back against what you might see as not enough action here, when you know that the context here is an extreme pushback that is more than would be normal for the political process? And I think you have to balance it. I think you can be relentlessly critical of a progressive or a Democratic administration and exclude and forget the context. Or you can be overly coddling of the administration because you're basically on their side. And I think MSNBC, they struggles with that balance all the time of how to serve the audience, which is very Democratic and pro this administration, for instance, or very anti necessarily Republicans, but still provide context. And I think that's the struggle, to still be a news organization, understanding who your audience is.
And Nermeen, were I right in interpreting what you're saying as that something like MSNBC is more part of the problem than part of the solution when one thinks about progressivism in America?
No, I think that's a misinterpretation. I'm not saying that any one particular channel or media outlet is complicit. I'm saying that if one looks at this rather than as individual players making individual choices, if one looks at it as a kind of broad constellation of different voices, where certain voices are almost in a sense structurally excluded. So it's not so much that I think, I take Joy's point, and it's a very serious point, which is that the terms of the debate, as they've been constructed, in other words, obviously, and that's another problem with the internet, in fact, because the internet is democratic, but not in the way that people often say. It's democratic also in a dreadful sense, which is that anyone with the most ghastly opinions in the world can publicize them to everybody in the world. So it's not just the left or progressives or independent voices that have access to the internet. It's everybody, even those whose views some of us might find objectionable. So within that constellation, one can see why in a certain context, and especially the context that you named, namely obviously an African-American president for the first time, a Democratic administration following on the heels of a very, let's say a different administration, it makes sense that certain decisions make sense. But I think that an important impetus for independent journalists is really to get, because you mentioned as well, Joy, that it's necessary to have a certain kind of alliance with power in order, in fact, for the work to be done. And I think that there has to be space, this constellation has to be expanded to include the voices whom we would never otherwise hear. So as I was walking in here, somebody handed me a little booklet on Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Finance, I think it was called. Yes, thank you. Part of Occupy Wall Street. So, for example, if one thinks of the media coverage of that movement, there were not very many media outlets who actually went to the encampment at Zuccotti Park and spoke to the people who, after all, lived there. Now, whatever one's opinions of that action were, or that attempt were, it was an event. Something happened. And isn't it incumbent on us, rather than either casting aspersions or in fact celebrating, one should find out what is it that was motivating these people. Now, these people obviously are the furthest thing from having power, but that doesn't mean that there should be no space within this constellation for their voice to be heard. And I think that that's, in my view, one of the singular failings of the corporate media for a whole host of reasons, which we can talk about. But I think the idea is to try to expand this constellation to people who, in fact, are really quite powerless.
I thought you were going to take that idea a different way when you talked about the sort of narrow parameters of what the presented alternatives are, because it does seem to me the country the basic assumptions are ever more conservative. That when Nelson Rockefeller was alive, he had the politics of Barack Obama, and he was a Republican. The Affordable Care Act, which I support, great, it was a Republican program. It was never on the table that there would be national health insurance of a sort that they have in Europe, either where, in the UK where the government pays the doctors, or in France and Germany where they have a system that's, you buy insurance, the government gives you the insurance in some complicated way. I lived in Germany for a year. I never understood it, but it was great. Whatever it was wonderful. Anyway, I feel that, I was reading, Nick Kristof the other day, and he's talking about, people don't realize, and there's much less desperate, true, horrible, living on $1 a day poverty around the world. That's great. And that is great. And then he talks about, we still have lingering pockets of poverty. Poverty lingers in America. And I think, what is this lingering what is this lingering? It has never gone away. You know, it went down like 3% or 4%, you know, from 1965 or whenever, and now it's right back to where it was before. And we have these ideas about our country that are very hard to get rid of. For example, invading other countries is a good way to bring democracy and progress to them. We really are kind of stuck on that one. And the other is that we are basically all some kind of middle class, except for some poor unfortunates over here. And I think that it would be really great if the media could help us to just see ourselves a little more honestly. You know, we're the superpower now, but we're not going to be the superpower forever, because the world economy is changing in all kinds of, you know, big ways. So these are things that the media very rarely brings up. For all the reasons that are the obvious reasons: who owns the media, what their interests are, what happens if you raise these disturbing issues, all like that.
Just to say, I mean, aren't there some subjects, you know, on which the possibilities in American politics discourse is clearly more progressive than it was in the time of Nelson Rockefeller? I mean, gay marriage in
yes, no,
states,
absolutely, absolutely.
Serious female presidential
Yes.
candidates. I mean,
Yes.
a guy named Barack Obama as president of the United
Yeah,
States.
I was thinking more of not those issues. I was thinking, look how many people are in prison now. And actually, Nelson Rockefeller had a lot to do with putting them there. But you know, if you go back to like the 40s and the 30s, people didn't serve these really long sentences for, you know, committing some crime. They didn't throw so many people in jail forever. And they had the death penalty everywhere, but they didn't use it all that much. And now we have millions of people in prison. And a lot of them for drug crimes that, in my opinion, they shouldn't be in there for. But it's just, there is, to me, a sense of like, we're just throwing away a lot of people. And the idea that you could sort of really kind of rethink the way we do crime and punishment in this country is really not on the cards. Like, for example, this guy who killed all those people in Norway, that horrible
Breivik.
reactionary nut. Yeah. So he's in a nice little Norwegian prison, and they decided to let him take college courses. Now, can you imagine what would happen in America if some murderer, I mean, they used to have college courses in prison, and mostly that's gone. But in these other countries, they think, okay, now we've got you. You're in prison. You can't kill any more people. But you should have if you want to learn something, you should go learn something. And I feel like that's gone, that used to be the way we saw things.
Let me just can I just follow up with you on the media a little bit on this question of, do you think that the progressive media, however you define it, has been too soft on Barack Obama and has allowed Barack Obama to be, because he's a nice, smiley, attractive face for American power, basically, has shied away from the more fundamental critiques of it?
Well, you're asking the wrong person, because I'm probably the last person at the nation who likes Barack Obama. And I always think, well, he's doing his best. You know, he's got those crazy, horrible Republicans. And every time, like last night, he gave a speech, and I'm on a list of progressive journalists, and everybody's saying, oh, he was so wimpy. You know, and they were making fun of him. Oh, right, he's holding his fire, ha, ha, ha. So I think, but I do think that, for example, in the issue of war, that we would have, if it was a Republican doing the things in the Middle East with the drones, we would see much more pushback on that. People would be in the streets if it was George W. Bush doing that, don't you think? But you don't want to, it's what you said, Joy, that you don't want to abandon the person who is in some sense, you feel, in some ways, on your side. even if he's in a lot of ways not on your side.
I mean, Nermeen, do you feel that from the perspective of where you sit at democracy, I mean, I think in some ways it's partly, I think, a certain kind of a human desire to want to have heroes in politics, to want to be, you know, good guys and good women who you identify with, so you don't only see yourself. I mean, there's something depressing about basically saying, oh, well, that president, that politician's evil, and that one's evil, and that one's evil, and that one's evil, and that one's evil, right? I mean, and so I guess I wonder, from your point of view, as being part of an institution that does, I think, does raise more of these fundamental oppositional questions about the very nature of the American state, as I said, do you ever feel that temptation to want to actually celebrate something that someone in power in American politics does?
Let's say I feel the desire that someone should act in such a way that I would feel like celebrating them. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, the moment that Barack Obama came out and said he was for gay marriage, the moment that Barack Obama was elected, you didn't say.
No, of course. Okay, look, of course, there are these, but you know, these are singular moments. And I don't know that, you know, in a culture that is also tends to be suffused with a kind of, the same thing, or at least I think in some sense it's connected. The same way in which people believe, no matter how desperate their circumstances are, or indeed how wealthy they are, that they're somehow all middle class. That, to me, is also somehow connected with the kind of, I don't know, positive take on things that everybody's like, you know, be happy and smile and things are great and terrific and things are getting better and so on. I don't think that it's necessary for, and in fact, I think I would go even further. I think that the media does a disservice when it joins in that chorus of celebration, because I think that there is enough celebration already. And I think, you know, the point that you made, Katha, and I'm very glad you made it, the question of poverty, of the increasing conservatism of the political discourse in the US, of the levels of, really staggering levels of incarceration in the US, which is of course also profoundly racially and class marked. I mean, class, that's another thing. Who mentions class in America? Because of course we're all middle class, there's no need to mention it.
I mean, wasn't the presidential election last year a significant measure about class?
Well,
I mean, it was,
but
the Obama campaign attacked Mitt Romney mercilessly and effectively as a plutocrat who was out of touch with people who didn't have 7 homes.
And you know, you said in an email, like when I asked you what we were going to talk about, you said you wanted to, the question of did the progressive media have an effect on the presidential election? And I'm thinking, well, yes, thank you, David Corn and Mother Jones. That's why we know about the 47% speech that Romney gave, that I think was profound. I think that affected people a lot. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. I have this really conservative neighbor up in the country who he listens to Rush Limbaugh and worse, I think, and Glenn Beck all the time. So he comes over after the speech and he says, "It's finished, it's over, Romney's gonna lose." And I said, "Well, Tom, don't give up, and why do you think that?" And he says, "Too many takers, you know, that 47%, they're all taking, and they're all gonna vote." That's what Glenn Beck was saying. All those people, the 47%, are going to vote for Obama to keep the spigots of government funding coming their way. But that had a big effect. I think it was like Occupy itself, which put we are the 99% into play. That it gave people the way, you know, to think about class and to see themselves in a class position. So thank you, David Corn. Thank you, Mother Jones.
Yeah, exactly. And Occupy as well, actually. That's one of the main, I think, services that Occupy Wall Street provided, which is to say, I mean, what does it mean to say, I mean, even that slogan, I don't know who came up with it, but it was just ingenious. We are the 99%. It all of a sudden brought into extremely dramatic relief the fact that the US is now also and of course I don't know statistically, but it seems to me from what I've read, far more unequal in terms of the distribution of income, of resources, of wealth, of opportunity than perhaps it's ever been. And there have been studies carried out that suggest that places that we think of as, old Europe, that the prospects for social mobility there now are greater than here.
But I see, I guess I have a slightly different take than you guys, because I think one of the things that happened even before Occupy was the crash, and before, I lived in Pembroke Pines, Florida, before I moved back to New York, and if you lived in Pembroke Pines, from the 90s to the mid-2000s, everyone was middle class, because you could be a nurse and have, I had a friend that was a nurse that she knew someone who had 2 and 3 homes. People, easy credit, there's a combination of 2 things that I think fundamentally sort of established the notion of this broad middle class. One of them was the democratization of the Wall Street investment. Then whoever invented the 401k tricked millions and millions of Americans into believing they were far wealthier than they were, and to caring about the stock market. When the stock market goes up or down, it doesn't really impact your life unless you are, invested in millions of dollars worth of stock, or you have stock options, or if you have a pension that is invested in them. But Americans have that little piece, that 401k that can get the statement every month. And suddenly people, particularly in the 90s, you feel very invested in the stock market. It goes up, you feel good, you spend more money, even if it doesn't make rational sense. And I think the second thing is easy credit and housing. And the fact that you could buy a home and your net worth was informed by this piece of property that was appreciating and felt like it would never end. And I think Americans are sort of naturally optimistic. After World War II, the boom meant, a refrigerator, a cold box in everyone's house, and this idea that you could have gadgets and things, and we're able to leverage not a great deal of income through credit to have a great deal of stuff that makes you feel middle class. So I think if you were to poll Americans in the 90s, everyone felt middle class. But the crash kind of sharpened the relief between the haves and have-nots, and left a lot of Americans finding out they were the have-nots, that they were them, not us, right? It wasn't us and them. Oh, wait, we're them. And I think that from a media perspective, because media is no longer cloth coat, because media people are not cloth coat people. Media people, again, are a lot more Ivy League. You have a lot more Harvard and Yale grads in there. It's not people like Brian Williams, who were just scrappy kids coming out of high school and deciding to become a beat reporter and moving up the ladder. That is not the way people go in the media. It's a lot of Ivy kids. It's a lot of people who live in the Beltway corridor between Washington and New York and don't go to Nebraska or don't go. So, it is a different world. And I think that the media has really refocused its attention on class since the crash, because people have had to. And I think Occupy sharpened it even more. And I actually think that the progressive media has been quite sharply critical of Obama. I don't think there's been any rah-rah cheering from the left of the president. I think as soon as he got in, there was a very sharp critique of him on not doing enough on issues for LGBT Americans that kept up relentlessly for a year, that really pushed him toward changing his position, or a lot of people say revealing his already authentic position on gay marriage. But that was a sharp drumbeat of criticism and pushing from the left. It wasn't the left cheering him on that did it. It was a lot of pushing. And I think that the president gets a constant pushback on things like drones. We hear it on MSNBC. There are some hours where he's getting a really relentless, sharp critique of his war policy. So I disagree that the progressive media has been soft on the president, and that the media has completely not paid attention to class. But I think it's Americans themselves that papered over this notion of class distinction. It's just that now there's no way to avoid it, because literally 1% of the country has made off like bandits, and the rest of us have just been left in the dust. And now people are trying to figure out who to blame. And for the right, they're very comfortable blaming everyone else and sort of really being connected to power when their person is in power. Whereas people on the left, I think, are quite uncomfortable with power, uncomfortable with being connected to power. So there's always an angst on the progressive side that just doesn't exist on the right.
I want to go back to something you said right at the beginning, which is that it's a great time to be read and a terrible time to get paid for it. So at my journalism school, one of the mantras of an important faculty member is that because of this, journalists have to become entrepreneurs. Journalists have to see themselves as small business people who, instead of outsourcing the business side to some thing, they have to figure out how they're going to get paid for it. They have to take it upon themselves. So this seems to me to be challenging for anybody, but particularly challenging for progressives who have their own problems with capitalism, right? So how does a progressive trying to live their own values, not necessarily wanting to be, a business person, perhaps, think about how to make a living in this environment and be able to write?
Well, I'm such a throwback. I mean, I actually get a salary from the Nation, so I don't have to deal quite so much with all this. But just to say something about the good side is, okay, the Nation has, I forget how many subscribers it is, but it's nowhere near as many people as see it on the web. So my column, which is on the web, has a much bigger reach than it would ever have if it was just in the paper magazine. And that's one way that, I can continue to love to be at the Nation, because it gets out, my work gets out there. But I think you're absolutely right. There is this, you have to be an entrepreneur thing that I'm just old enough to not have to quite deal with. But younger people, definitely. And it's all this stuff about branding yourself and networking. And I'm thinking, I just want to write. I just want to do my work and turn it in, and it gets edited, and then people read it, and I get paid for it. I don't want to market myself in that way. It's not about progressive or anything. It's just, I think there are probably many conservative writers who feel the same way, that, if you publish a book now, in your book proposal that you write to get your contract, they want to know, what are you going to do to publicize your book? What are your contacts? What do you see as, how you can leverage yourself? And I'm thinking, hey, writing a book is really tough. Publicity people used to do this. What happened to them? And I think you're absolutely right. There is this sort of real excessive, it asks a whole different set of qualities of people that, you could be a writer and not, did John Keats leverage himself? Did he brand himself? I'm the Nightingale poet? No, he just did his writing. It didn't work out too well for him in his lifetime, but the point, you understand what I'm saying. Yeah.
And so what do you say to younger people who maybe like Katha, they just want to write and do good work, right? But is that enough? What would you say that people, especially progressives, who want to do work that they believe in, but also want to be able to feed themselves and their families, what should they do?
It's very difficult because, I know we struggle with that and I tell a lot of writers, this may not be your best life now. If this $200, that you're going to get to write this piece is the difference between you paying your rent and not, this is not the life for you. I was a freelance writer for a long time. It's very difficult, and it is a business, and you have to be the good guy and the bad guy, the good guy that's turning in this wonderful work, and the bad guy that's chasing your money. Yeah. And it's very hard to get paid, and it's not a lot of money, and freelance writing means having 10 different clients or 8 that you write for, maybe doing some corporate writing on the side. It's a business, and if you want to just write just for the love of it, that's why you should have a blog. That's why you should have a Tumblr and just write whatever makes you happy. But if you want to make money at it, you are going to have to brand yourself. You are going to have to get acquainted with social media. You're going to have to do all of those things that Ms. Pollitt is saying absolutely she doesn't want to do, because it's the only way to survive. And even for us, the Grio is kind of an entrepreneurial small business inside of MSNBC. And we are still under tremendous pressure to make money. No matter how much we love the writing we're putting out, we're trying to do great pieces, and we're trying to do this work we're passionate about. What our bosses want us to do is make money. And so there is this pressure, whether it's an individual or a small business, to do it. One way a lot of writers are that I know that are smart about it are getting together and doing group blogs where they're actually able, because there are 4 or 5 of them who are popular and who have a social media profile, advertisers will actually pay for that you have 10,000 Twitter followers, and if 2 or 3 people who have that kind of following can get together and sort of do some of these group sites, sometimes they can get into ad networks and make a little bit of money. The other people I think are brilliant at it, one who probably people here will like and one who people won't, the one people may think more of is Andrew Sullivan. Andrew Sullivan, who worked with you at the Daily Beast and who was previously at the Atlantic, went out on his own and did a subscription model where he had built up a following where if you really love and want to read Andrew Sullivan, you subscribe for a small amount of money, and he's doing pretty well. On the other extreme of that, Glenn Beck did the same thing, got booted out of Fox News, but what he essentially did was, Glenn Beck was a fairly ordinary right-wing talk host who went on HLN, kind of went a little crazy, then went on Fox and went absolutely stark raving mad, built up this huge following, and then took it into the private sector. He's made something like $60 million off of something most people would say, this isn't crazy. Why would anyone, or someone like Alex Jones, we just think is nuts. Alex Jones, I think, makes about $5 million a year because he has these subscribers that are dedicated that will pay $12 a month. And all you have to do is get them on a subscription. I think people on the right are much more less just shameful about doing that. They will go out there and monetize everything they do. If you want to listen to Rush Limbaugh's podcast back after his show, you pay him. Yeah. And there are a lot of media people who don't have time to listen to Rush at noon but have to comment on it. There are media people that are on the far left that are paying Rush Limbaugh every month to listen to his show because they have to comment on it. So there are ways that people are doing it. The people who do these media criticism sites, like Mediaite, which I think of as a conservative site, but they go on and all they do is comment on other media and make money. So there are lots of ways to do it, but you have to think outside the box.
I mean, what do you say to people who want to, write because they love writing or because they believe in the ideas what advice do you give them?
I don't know. Suicide? No, I'm just joking, obviously not. Well, I think one question that actually I am interested in, and I don't quite understand how it works. It's true that for writers it is very difficult, and that's really remarkable. I had no idea. $60 million, that's an extraordinary amount of money for an extraordinary man. Why it is that here, even for mainstream media or established media outlets, who obviously the way in which they make money is through advertisement, which is, by various corporations. But at the same time, there seems to be this, and perhaps because a tradition hasn't existed, I don't know. I'm really asking because I don't know the answer, that there seems to be some kind of suspicion of what media would look like if it received, for example, I don't know, government subsidies like Deutsche Welle in Germany or the BBC in the UK, or I don't know, there are countless examples from elsewhere in the world. And I'm not saying that would be right, but why is it that the same suspicion, let's say, doesn't apply to corporations? In other words, if corporations fund media, why wouldn't we as the consumers of that media wonder whether what the corporations are interested in would somehow be reflected in the content that we're able to see or read, whereas we would be immediately suspicious if we learned that the government were funding a particular source of media, or even if we weren't suspicious, we would constantly keep in mind, oh, we're reading this, I mean, I'm not saying this is the case, but just as the example that I cited, this is on the BBC, and it's about something that the UK has been doing elsewhere, so we should keep in mind that what they're saying about what they're doing may not actually be the full representation of the truth. Sorry, that doesn't in fact at all respond to your question. I mean, I think what Joy said is absolutely true. I mean, the only way, it seems to me, to do this now is to have a spirit, which of course I singularly lack, but an entrepreneurial one, in which one tries to come up with these, and then there's also this entire culture. But I think young people now are extremely good at this. I mean, they grew up with reading YouTube. What is YouTube? The YouTube, broadcast yourself. So they have, and all these young people now, when they submit resumes for jobs and so on, they have their own website. So, I think that if you're attuned to this logic of professionalization, of self-promotion, I mean, not in the vulgar sense, although of course it can be that too, I think they're much more adept than, perhaps previous generations are. So I don't know what the possible success of that is, but that's certainly one way to do it. And then the other way, like like Democracy Now!, a lot of independent media, we're not the only ones by any means, are funded by our viewer and viewer funded. That's a very difficult thing to do, but it's certainly an alternative for independent voices.
Can I comment on one thing just to add to, because I always found this very strange, like in the NSA story, and I think this is to your point, is that the coverage of it, the idea that the NSA, right, is grabbing and spying on your emails and spying on your communications online. But people in my business never ask the second part of that question. Where are they getting it? If they're subpoenaing your emails from Google, we never got to the second half of that, which is that Google is spying on everything you write. Whenever you write an email, you're giving dozens of points of data to Google. And then they're using that and monetizing it. They're monetizing it so that if you look and you send a friend an email saying, I just took Amtrak, miraculously, Amtrak ads start appearing above your mail, right? Have you ever noticed that? And you're sending dozens of independent pieces of data, where you are, what time it is, who you contact often, what kinds of things you talk about, what kinds of things are in your subject lines. You're sending that, you're sharing that. Same thing when you use Twitter, same thing when you use Facebook, and you're giving even the most probably to Facebook. These are private corporations that are selling it. They're not sharing it just with the Justice Department, they're selling it. The only way the government can get your data is you give it to them. You're giving it to corporations without thinking twice about it. And people are so freaked out that the government can go to a court and subpoena it, but they couldn't subpoena it if we didn't freely give of everything about ourselves freely to corporations. I think that just shows how completely corporations have sort of bedazzled Americans, where Americans have no fear whatsoever of corporations. They think of corporations as our friend, that what Ronnie said, corporations are people.
Are people.
And we think that. We ourselves
Friendly
think
people.
that. Right, Twitter's our friend. And so I'm fascinated that we are terrified of the government we own and who work for us and who are essentially our employees, but we are completely unafraid of the corporations who own everything about us, that we're giving them for free and they're selling for money. I just find that funny.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take some questions from the audience. In the little bit we have, go ahead, and maybe say who you want to direct your question to. Katha?
Well, I guess my hope is, which is often disappointed, and I have written many columns that are very critical of Barack Obama, but in the real world of horrible politics, I don't want to take my marbles and just go say, you know, a plague on both your houses. I think we have to somehow try to move, you know, the Democrats left, and sometimes I think that's a completely useless way to spend any time at all. But if you don't do that, then you're kind of opting out. I mean, I went and voted today. I went and voted for public advocate, a meaningless position, and that it has a budget of $2.3 million, and the election itself cost $20 million. And why did I do that? I did that because I'm thinking, well, Tish James, you know, good for her. I hear good things about her, and maybe this will set her up to do something bigger. It's a stepping stone, as it is for, I'm going to vote for Bill de Blasio, too, no matter how many things the New York Times publishes about, you know, oh, my goodness, he went to Nicaragua, and oh, my goodness, he was nice to these real estate people over here. Yes, they all sell you out. That's the thing, because we're in a system. It's not just individual people, and are they good or are they bad? There's a whole political system where the way, you know, that people who have power are the people who have power. And the people, they all need to get donations from the people who have the money. So I guess I just start by saying, yes, Barack Obama is going to be a terrible president, the way every other president is a terrible president. But maybe he won't be as terrible a president as Romney would have been. I mean, those are the choices. That's as far as I can go.
Who else has a question? Please.
Focus some of what was discussed this evening on cable news, for example, in particular. It seems to me with something like Fox News, you've got a station that focuses everything through the prism of Democrats bad, Republicans good. It's totally predictable. I don't watch it. And I'm glad that, for example, that MSNBC is to some degree an alternative, except what bothers me is that too much of the time it seems to me is simply the reverse prism. Republicans bad, Democrats good. And if Democrats aren't good, well, maybe we won't discuss it. And I really wish there was more of a focus on issues for their own sake rather than filtering through a Democratic or Republican position who's better on it, because there's other points of view in this country beyond what's embodied in one or the other of those political parties. And for example, to take a couple of issues like Katha brought up, like incarceration rates and the problems with our drug laws, I've heard some excellent discussions on MSNBC on subjects like that, where the focus of the discussion remained on those issues and not getting into, well, what did the Republicans say about it, what does the Democrats say about it. And I think the coverage could get away from just always, from the standpoint of the two parties and looking at issues and their merits or whatever for themselves. To me, it would be more satisfying coverage.
I'm going to ask you to respond to this. I mean, I wonder whether, to some degree, giving the back and forth, the kind of, the sport of our side versus their side is partly what viewers want, right? I mean, it's not, is it, I mean, I don't know what, you would know
Right.
better than me at MSNBC,
Yeah.
but it seems to me it's not only because people can't think outside the box
Right.
of Democrats versus Republicans, it's also because that's part of the way that people follow politics, our guys versus their guys.
Absolutely, it's more of a horse race. But I mean, I was going to suggest that, he did mention he did, but that you listen to Melissa Harris Perry or Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes. I mean, they're doing incredibly nuanced discussion. I mean, Melissa's done an hour on the prison to the prison pipeline. I mean, there's a lot of that. I don't think I've ever seen anything like what some of my colleagues at MSNBC do on Fox or even CNN, the depth that they go into. So I disagree that we're just doing horse race all day. I think that you have to also think about day parts too. I mean, the people who are watching during Morning Joe on through the early morning, the late morning, early afternoon, are watching for politics. They're watching for the horse race. They're watching for the back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. And I don't, maybe just because I work there and I hear a lot of our discussion on the air about why won't Barack Obama maybe talk to the Republicans? And is there some compromise the White House could come to? Is there something Obama should be saying? Should he be having them over to lunch? Maybe he should have more lunches. I think maybe if he invited them over, Tip O'Neill would have gone and put his finger in their chest and hey, that would have really changed it. Putting your finger into the chest of Mitch McConnell is going to change anything. So I find I'm a little bit in a different page. I feel like we spend so much time critiquing and dissecting why Obama can't somehow horse whisper Republicans into doing sane things instead of just admitting that sometimes the other side is out of their mind. Like I feel like we do go out of our way to not just say Republicans bad and to constantly belabor the ways in which Democrats could somehow compel, hug, kiss, feed, burp the Republicans into behaving themselves. So my perspective is that we spend too much time doing that. And I'd rather just try to maybe work our way into more of a discussion of who's really at fault. This both sides meme that Politico.com has perfected, the sort of beltway on the one hand, on the other hand, both sides do it. That's how politics is covered to me, by and large, in America.
It raises a question that I'd be interested in asking you guys about. I mean, I think especially today, because of obviously the budget fight, I think in recent, the progressive analysis of the Republican Party basically comes down to crazy, stupid, racist. You know, basically everything, almost everything they can do, maybe warmongering. You know, everything basically. I feel like, you know, and I wonder whether I wonder whether the progressive media does a good enough job of actually understanding of giving conservatives a little bit more credit. I mean, whether of actually trying to see the world through the eyes of people who may have a different set of experiences, live in a different part of the country, and perhaps show some kind of empathy for fellow citizens who actually genuinely feel very passionately different about things. And I just wonder if you feel like that's something that the progressive media could do better, or if in fact that maybe it's the wrong way of thinking. Anyone want to? Kathy, do you have a response?
Well, it sounds like anthropology to me. That would be good. That would be good.
If you talk, I mean, in my experience, if you talk to certain kinds of people running certain kinds of small businesses, not
Yes.
all small businesses,
Right.
depends on the particular circumstances they're in. But some of them, people who I know, are not crazy or racist or ignorant, who used to be liberals, and in many ways still are liberals, but have had a particular experience. I've heard many, many times say to me, if you had the experiences that I had in trying to comply with certain kinds of government regulations, and including some references to Obamacare, you'd be surprised at how conservative you would sound, right? Does the progressive media do a good enough job of recognizing that those people might not actually be crazy racist, but actually are reflecting an experience that actually exists?
I think I agree with you. I think that part of it is, again, the fact that so much of the media is based in the Washington to New York corridor and may not really get to Mississippi or to Louisiana or to Missouri and really talk to people, and sort of there's a caricature of the right sometimes. And I think it's amplified by the behavior sometimes of their representatives who are trying to reflect only the farthest right tier of their base. But if you just went into their districts in the sort of center, you know, not the people who are the loudest, but just sort of ordinary people. I mean, I remember was covering the First Lady's Let's Move tour, and her Let's Move tour was mostly in red states. And the first stop was in Mississippi. And I had a conversation with this guy. He was a dentist who owned a newspaper. So he was covering it in the pool as a journalist, but he's also a dentist. And we had this long conversation, lifelong Republican, very conservative. And he told me something I had never heard before. And he said, yeah, I'm buying a lot of these AR-15s. I'm one of these people that's buying lots and lots of these guns. And he said, what people don't understand is, number one, the shooting culture here is multi-ethnic, you know, of the people who we're going out and shoot with. It's not just old white guys, you know, we're not like Klansmen, we're not doing anything. And that also, he's like, people don't understand is the reason a lot of people are buying these guns is that the fear of regulations is making the value of them go up. So he's like, I went out and bought 2 of them the minute I heard there might be gun control, because these things are actually valuable. So I'm, you know, it's as a collection. So he's like, people never think that. They just assume I have more than one gun, so I'm a crazy potential shooter, you know? And I think that had never occurred to me. So I do think we shouldn't caricature all of people on the right. There are people who are just small business owners who really do feel it would be a burden if they had to raise their employees' salaries to $10 an hour, and they really genuinely don't feel they could afford it. And so to them, it smacks of elitism for us to insist that they pay $12 an hour. So I think that, yeah, we have to be a little bit less caricature and more sort of understanding them, as long as the tactics are fair on both sides, I think.
Yeah, and I'd also like to just add that I think the point is the one that you raised, but it's also not so much trying to represent the other side, as it were, as looking at it on a political spectrum, such as it is here, but rather on the distinction that you made, right, an ordinary person.
Right.
And I think if there is a dearth of representation on the media of voices, I think in all senses. I mean, even if you say that the commentators that come on these shows tend to be, as you pointed out, I mean, the journalists who work there, Harvard, Yale, et cetera, they come from a particular class, and that class, whether you're on the left or the right, is narrow. And so the experiences, the desires, the anxieties, et cetera, of the large majority of Americans, not to say the world, are very rarely represented. And I think that the media could do a great deal more to make sure that those voices, like as you said, going to Mississippi and so on, and talking to these people, it could do a great deal more to represent that. And the other thing is that it's also, you can say that, well, this is what viewers want. Viewers want, Republican, Democrat, et cetera. But I don't know, to me it's an interesting question. Does an audience exist kind of a priori? There is this audience and you want this, therefore I will give you this. Or is an audience produced? In other words, the more you produce a particular thing, the more an audience will consume that particular thing. But what would happen if you started producing different things? I don't know.
Please.
I would just like to say that we have choices in life. There is such a thing as NPR. There is such a thing as PBS. There is such a thing as documenting films. And we have choices. And listening to this, I feel, the public suffers from adulation of celebrity. And there are wonderful stories that I hear, StoryCorps, wonderful writing, wonderful stories you would never read in the newspaper or hear on any of these channels. And so, for that reason, I feel that people are not making choices. And they're out there. They really are out there.
That's such an interesting point, because I started reading The Guardian online in the run-up to the war in Iraq, because they had news that really was not being published anywhere in the mainstream American press. And then I just got into the habit, The Guardian, now I read it all the time. And I know a lot about British politics. But I think, no, you're completely right. And I sometimes think, well, it's like William Carlos Williams said, that he says, the reader has to do some work, basically, I'm paraphrasing. And I feel like, NPR is there. And if you listen to NPR as opposed to listening to Glenn Beck, you would have a more rational view of what the world is like. So then you have to ask, okay, all this information is out there, more than one person could ever consume, even if they did nothing else. So they're choosing to listen to this or listen to that. And that choice is sort of directed by, a lot of the time, by what they already think, right? They're reading to certain things to confirm what they already believe. And it's at that point that I become quite despairing, because how do you break out of that? People are always saying, yes, now conservatives just read the conservative press, and liberals just read the liberal press. There used to be more a kind of mainstream thing. What about that?
Oh, sorry.
No. Just,
let me put you on the spot then for each of you.
Yeah.
Who do you read regularly? Who you fundamentally disagree with? Who you feel like who you still nonetheless really profit from reading or watching?
Oh dear.
Are you asking the audience?
No,
Are you asking us? I just was joking.
I'm fine to start. When I used to do radio. I used to do talk radio. And I used to listen to Glenn Beck. I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh. I wanted to hear what they had to say. And Glenn Beck, actually, before he went to HLN, was a really good broadcaster, a really excellent broadcaster, great storyteller. He would tell these long-form stories that, I didn't agree with his point of view, but he was actually a very good broadcaster. And if you were trying to get into talk radio, you wanted to listen to sort of the top people. I used to listen to them. Clearly, once he got on TV, he went nuts, and I can only do Rush Limbaugh for about 5 minutes, and that's about it. I can't take it. But Glenn Beck used to be actually a really quality broadcaster. But now, I don't enjoy it, but I read Politico every morning because I have to get the Beltway take. I do read the National Review. I do regularly look at Hot Air and Red State because I want to know what they're thinking, and read them. Eric Erickson and the people at Hot Air blog on the right.
This is anthropology. This is not because you think they might tell you something that really might make you have to question your own.
Right. I mean, I think as far as conservatives that I actually read with an interest in their point of view genuinely, probably David Frum, Andrew Sullivan would be the two conservative writers that I actually take seriously. But they're not that, if they're still considered conservative.
How about you?
Well, without naming names, there are columnists whom I read who probably in some context may be considered liberal, but it's not the context I have in the New York Times. And occasionally in the studio, you'll be shocked to hear, we do have on one of the televisions Fox News. And it's not, of course, in that case, it's not to say what, obviously we're not going to see something on Fox News and think, oh God, we should really be covering it with this, whatever issue with that angle. But it's, of course, to know what the diversity of views that are being expressed. And there's Fox, and there's CNN, and there's MSNBC. And we used to have, till they took it off the air, Al Jazeera English. And again, Al Jazeera English, because it's not so much, I don't think about, again, it is conservative voices, that's one part of it, but I think that's only one part of it. I think the other part of it is getting, the way that Al Jazeera English, for example, covered the protests when they first began in Tahrir Square in Cairo. I don't think there was any other coverage here that was comparable.
Even close.
Yeah. I mean, we had Sharif Abdul Qaddus, who's a brilliant reporter who was in Cairo and who covered the protests phenomenally well. Al Jazeera English, of course, has enormous resources, and they did a fabulous job. So we watched them quite regularly. And again, the emphasis was on trying to hear, which as they did, they spoke to activists of a very wide range of spectrums that they represented from, at that time, it was 2.5 years ago when it first began, including from the Muslim Brotherhood, liberal secularists, feminists, etc., a very wide range of so-called ordinary people.
Katha?
Gosh, you're really putting me on the spot here. I guess I hate Reid a lot of people. I hate Reid Ross Douthat, for example. When he writes about something sort of in my area, when he writes about reproductive rights or something, I'll read that just to sort of get my juices flowing. And you want to say, okay, here's what he thinks, here's what's wrong with it. I realize that I'm a bad person because I should be reading. There should be conservatives that I read informationally and, because they might change my mind about something. And I'm going to go home and do that.
There we go. The glasses.
Yeah, totally different level of question. There's a whole thing now called born digital, which most of us aren't. And I know you're representing things that started out paper and are now adding digital. So I'm asking, do you think that paper will continue to exist in that coverage? Because it seems to me one of the major problems with digital, they're very short little quippy things, whether they're from the left or, they're not really any kind of in-depth research, or there's very little of it, very little analysis. So I'm just wondering what your takes are on the future of print and if you see it as related in depth.
Let me just say something that I'll do. I think to equate print with serious investigative journalism is wrong. I think that actually a lot of serious investigative journalism is coming and is going to increasingly come from unexpected places. Partly places that are nonprofit, but partly places that are actually able to pay for it. BuzzFeed, which is not an institution that one would confuse with the New York Review of Books, is actually devoting tremendous resources to investigative journalism. And they are doing it partly because they have resources, because they're actually making money. But I also think because they actually think that it's because they're not only in it to make money, and actually even more strangely, because even from a purely money-making point of view, having a reputation for also actually doing something valuable and serious might ultimately be good for the bottom line. So I think actually it's not as bleak on this score as it might sometimes appear. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, as somebody who still writes for a newspaper, I still write a column. It's incredible. People underestimate the reliance and dependence TV has had, particularly on newspapers over the years. A lot of the story generation has come from newspapers. You know, the local newspaper in a market is generating a lot of the initial stories that are then being followed up on by local news. And the reduction in bureaus and an investment by newspapers is a sort of existential threat in a lot of ways to television news, because so much of it is symbiotic. Something starts in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and that is the basis for what's on TV. And so I think that a lot of big media companies are responding to the shrinking of the newspaper pool in some of these big markets. I mean, New Orleans, NOLA is now completely online, and they're responding to that by adding resources so that television and also people like us, like internet-based, all digital companies, are having of necessity to invest in our own resources to do story generation, to find our own reporters, to put people out there. So it's sort of forcing both old media and new media to get off the pipeline of newspapers and be so dependent on them. So I actually am with you. I'm a little bit optimistic. I don't think that newspapers going away, and I think they are going away. I think in 20 years they'll be all online, and and magazines probably going. It's difficult, you know, for the economies of scale are so difficult, and the production costs are so high compared to what you can earn, that the smart people are going digital. But I still think there will be resources. They'll just be from online.
Why don't we take a couple, maybe we'll bundle 2 or 3 questions and give you guys each a chance to respond to all of them. Go ahead. Now let's just do one question. I think give other people a chance. What is progressive media? Who else has a question? Go ahead.
Hi, this question is for all the people in you here. What advice would you have for someone who's just starting out in media? You know, as like a 20-year-old, how to get paid and be living with writing, like how to navigate that, you know, best time, worst time.
Okay, sure. Sir? All right, we'll take one more. Did you have your hand up? No?
Yeah. I would love a recommendation from each of you on what you look at to find this, good investigatory journalism. Because I haven't found it, and it just may be that I'm not with it. So I'd like to know what each of you recommend for information. Like the New York Times, I know, when I used to see it 25 years ago before I left New York, they would print actual material. So you could look at it. They wouldn't give just opinions. By the time I came back, they were doing much more like as the LA Times had done, just give opinions. And I'm not sure the opinions are reconciled with the actual material. But where would each of you, if you wanted to find something, a particular area, what's going on, where would you look today?
Okay. Okay, great. So I'm going to start with you, Joy, and there are 4 questions. You don't have to answer all of them.
Okay.
The ones that are interesting to you. The first is, how do you define progressive media? The second is, what advice would you give to someone just starting out, which we talked about a bit earlier? What do you think of a businessman like Jeff Bezos taking over the Washington Post? And where would you go for investigative journalism?
Yeah, I'll answer very fast. I think progressive media is media without a giant corporate sponsor. I think, what was the second one?
What advice would you give to someone just starting out?
Write a blog and be very self-promotional, make sure lots of people read it, pitch everybody, do lots of the thing I hate, which is networking, and be a pest, because the pest will get a response eventually. The third one is Jeff Bezos. I think, unfortunately, this is where it's going. And by the way, next time you go on BuzzFeed, ask yourself how they make money. There's no ads. You don't see any ads. It's experiential advertising. You click on one of those 30 picture things, it's an ad. You just don't know it. And then the fourth one is, where do I go for investigative journalism? I think places like Mother Jones are doing great stuff, but again, that's access. I mean, the Mother Jones folks, they get leaks. And in order to get leaks, you have to talk to people and know people, and you have to network, and you have to make friends, sometimes in high places, which is always the disconnect, which is that's the only way you get information.
Great. You don't have to answer all four, but
Sorry.
You're welcome to. Progressive media, advice for someone just starting out, Jeff Bezos.
Got it.
And investigative journalism.
Well, I think on the progressive media question and the investigative journalism question, you know, one of the quotes, this is of course well before I became a journalist myself, that struck me very much was George Bernard Shaw, who wrote that a journalist is someone who seemingly fails to distinguish between a bicycle accident and the collapse of civilization. Now, what is the point of that? So for me, what progressive, or let's say left, independent, critical journalism, or an investigative journalism that has depth, these forms combine this singular ability to look at the minute details of a particular event, but at the same time to place it in a larger context and understand how it fits in to other things that are occurring, so one doesn't get lost in a whole series of facts and particularities when it's part of a larger trend and so on. Now, who's good at doing that? I don't know. There are a few sources that I have that I rely on very much. But it is, again, it's my own proclivity, which is long-form journalism. So there's the London Review of Books, there's the New York Review of Books, they're long-form on television, again, Al Jazeera English, and of course you don't even need to you can just go online and do searches for video content, and you can find it. You don't need to get a cable or whatever to watch it. What else is good? The Guardian, as you said, Katha. The Guardian is also something that I've read more and more in the last 10 years that I've been here. Again, for some of their investigative pieces have been very, very good. And The Guardian in the US is expanding. Of course, they have a New York office now, and they're bringing out more and more stories that are relevant to the US. Is that enough? Have I?
Yeah, great. Katha.
Let's see. Well, just to get back to the progressive media thing, and to complicate what Joyce said, I wouldn't say just not being corporate makes you progressive, because the thing about smaller magazines that are run by individual people is it all depends on who. It's, you know, the freedom of the press belongs to the person who owns the press. The National Review and The Nation are actually very similar in their economic model of, you know, like-minded people fund this magazine, and one is very liberal and the other is very conservative. So I would say the progressive media is about where you stand politically. It's about, are you, you know, do you favor more equality, more social justice, more rights for women, less racism, more democracy, all that kind of thing. And I actually think there are some really, really good progressive magazines. I would say, besides The Nation, there's Mother Jones is great. It's saddled with that ridiculous name, but it's really become a wonderful magazine. And there are others that are potentially very good, but they're undercapitalized. I mean, The Progressive, for example, is, you know, for the is based in the Midwest. It's really good, but because they don't have any money, they can't come out very often. And the same is true of In These Times, which used to come out, I think it was every other week, and now it's, I don't know, every quarter, it's not even every month, I think. It's every 2 months. And you can't really, you know, you can't really be in the swim of things if you come out every 2 months. So I would say everybody here go subscribe to a wonderful progressive magazine and help out, because it's true, people never miss the water till the well runs dry, like they say, and then the magazine is in terrible trouble, and then they fold, and everybody says, oh, yeah, I always meant to read that. Yeah, that was really good. Why is that folding? So, you know, it's a two-way street. There are the writers and there are the readers. And I think, yes, someone like Jeff Bezos, that's obviously going to be the model, is some immensely rich person buying a toy that will help him in his quest to, you know, for social dominance of some sort of, you know, to be the king, I don't know. Advice to the 22-year-old, I would say, you know, I will say there is one thing that is really true, which is, I'm sorry to say, that I think people get too easily discouraged. And I think it's women get too easily discouraged because, whether because they accurately perceive that it's not going to, you know, that there's a lot of prejudice against them, or because of other factors. Nonetheless, you know, if you want to do something, you have to just not get discouraged by rejection, because you're going to get a lot of it. Because mostly when people start out writing, they're not as good as they will be later, so they're going to get rejected a lot. So you have to become a better writer and, you know, just keep knocking on those doors. And then they'll publish your stuff and not pay you.
Well, on that less than cheery note, but realistic note, thank you all very, very much for coming. Thanks for the